History rarely warns those who are about to be tested. In the autumn of 1950, confidence ran high among United Nations forces fighting on the Korean peninsula. What had begun months earlier as a desperate defense against invasion was quickly turning into what many believed would be a decisive victory. The North Korean army had been pushed back, broken, and scattered. Seoul had been liberated. The enemy appeared to be in full retreat. For American soldiers and Marines, the belief was simple and widespread. The war would be over by Christmas. But history, as it often does, had other plans. The Korean peninsula is a land shaped by extremes. Jagged mountains dominate the landscape, cutting off valleys and isolating roads. Winters arrive early and without mercy. In the northern regions, cold is not merely uncomfortable, it is lethal. And in late 1950, as United Nations forces pushed north toward the Yalu River, they were entering one of the harshest environments any modern army had ever faced. At the heart of this frozen wilderness lay a remote body of water known as the Chosin Reservoir. It was here that confidence would collide with reality. The strategic objective was clear. United Nations Command, under General Douglas MacArthur, sought to push all remaining enemy forces out of North Korea and unify the peninsula. Intelligence assessments indicated minimal resistance ahead. Reports suggested Chinese intervention was unlikely or limited at best. Those reports would prove tragically wrong. Unbeknownst to most American units, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army had already crossed the Yalu River in massive numbers. Moving almost exclusively at night, avoiding roads, and using the mountains as cover, Chinese forces infiltrated deep into North Korea undetected. Entire divisions disappeared into the terrain, waiting for winter. By late November, temperatures near the Chosin Reservoir had dropped to nearly 30 degrees below Fahrenheit. The cold was unlike anything most American troops had ever experienced. Metal burned bare skin. Lubricants froze solid. Radios failed. Even simple tasks became dangerous. Yet the advance continued. The U.S. X-Corps, composed largely of the 1st Marine Division and elements of the U.S. Army's 7th Infantry Division, moved along narrow mountain roads stretching north and south of the reservoir. These roads were the lifelines of the operation. There were no alternate routes. No wide plains. No room to maneuver. Every unit was strung out along a single fragile artery. The Marines moved west of the reservoir. The Army units held positions to the east. Between them lay frozen terrain, steep ridges, and long supply lines exposed to attack. Still, there was little sense of alarm. Patrols encountered only scattered resistance. Prisoners spoke vaguely of Chinese soldiers, but intelligence officers dismissed these reports or underestimated their scale. The belief persisted that any Chinese presence was limited and disorganized. Meanwhile, in the mountains, tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers were silently positioning themselves. They carried minimal equipment. No heavy armor. Few vehicles. What they lacked in firepower, they compensated for with numbers, discipline, and an extraordinary tolerance for suffering. Many wore thin uniforms and cloth shoes. Many carried little food. Their orders were simple. Surround the enemy. Cut the roads. Attack at night. At the end of November, the trap was ready. The first major signs came suddenly and without warning. Chinese forces struck isolated outposts under cover of darkness, overwhelming positions through sheer numbers. Bugles and whistles echoed through the night, an unnerving sound designed to confuse and intimidate. The attacks were close, violent, and relentless. For many American soldiers, it was the first realization that this was not a retreating enemy. This was a coordinated assault. Reports flooded in. Entire units were under attack. Roads were blocked. Communications were failing. What had been assumed to be a simple advance had transformed overnight into a desperate fight for survival. At Chosin, American forces were no longer advancing into enemy territory. They were surrounded. The Chinese offensive did not announce itself with artillery barrages or air raids. It arrived quietly, methodically, and with terrifying precision. Under the cover of darkness, Chinese soldiers flowed down the mountains like shadows, slipping between American positions, bypassing strongpoints, and striking where defenses were weakest. By nightfall on November 27, 1950, the illusion of control had completely collapsed. American units along the Chosin perimeter reported attacks from every direction. Small outposts were overrun within minutes. Roads that had been open hours earlier were suddenly blocked by ambushes and roadblocks. Supply convoys vanished into the darkness. Communication lines fell silent. The cold intensified everything. Men who were wounded could not afford to lie still. Blood froze on clothing. Morphine syringes hardened. Plasma became unusable. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and faces with merciless speed. Soldiers learned quickly that survival depended as much on movement as on firepower. The Chinese attacked almost exclusively at night, using human wave tactics refined through years of civil war. They advanced in dense formations, absorbing heavy casualties to overwhelm American positions. Bugles, horns, and shouted commands echoed through the frozen valleys, creating an atmosphere of chaos and dread. Yet discipline held. Marine and Army units formed defensive perimeters, fighting through the night and regrouping at dawn. Officers moved between positions under fire, restoring order, issuing commands, and reinforcing morale. Machine gun crews fired until their weapons froze, then cleared them by hand, often with bare skin exposed to metal. One Marine later recalled that the cold was so intense it felt alive, an enemy that never slept. As the attacks intensified, the true scale of the Chinese presence became undeniable. Reports confirmed that entire divisions were operating around the reservoir. American forces were no longer facing a limited intervention. They were facing a massive, coordinated encirclement. At Yudam-ni, Marine regiments found themselves nearly cut off. To the south, at Hagaru-ri, engineers and support troops hurried to fortify what would soon become a critical stronghold. To the east, Army units of the 7th Infantry Division fought desperately to hold ground against repeated assaults. Every position mattered. Every delay cost lives. General Oliver P. Smith quickly grasped the reality of the situation. The mission had fundamentally changed. There would be no breakthrough to the Yalu. There would be no rapid victory. The objective now was to preserve the force and fight its way south. But this was no simple withdrawal. The only route south ran through narrow mountain passes already contested by the enemy. Any movement would require coordinated attacks, defensive holds, and precise timing. Mistakes would be fatal. Smith issued his now famous assessment to his commanders. Retreat, as traditionally understood, was impossible. Movement south would be conducted as an attack, deliberate, aggressive, and controlled. This mindset spread rapidly through the ranks. Marines and soldiers understood that panic meant death. Cohesion meant survival. As daylight broke after the first nights of heavy fighting, the landscape revealed the cost. Bodies lay frozen where they had fallen, sometimes locked in the positions they had died defending. Equipment shattered by cold littered the snow. The wounded were evacuated when possible, often carried by hand over miles of frozen terrain. Despite the chaos, units held. At Hagaru-ri, engineers raced to complete an airstrip under constant threat. The frozen ground resisted every attempt to dig. Explosives were used to break the earth. As the strip took shape, enemy attacks intensified, recognizing its importance. When the first aircraft finally landed, it was more than a logistical victory. It was a psychological lifeline. Supplies flowed in. Wounded flowed out. Hope returned, even as the fighting worsened. The Chinese, sensing the importance of Hagaru-ri, launched repeated assaults to overrun the perimeter. They attacked at night, probing for weaknesses, testing defenses. Each attack was repelled at tremendous cost on both sides. Meanwhile, at Yudam-ni, Marines faced the grim reality that they were nearly isolated. Orders arrived that would define the next phase of the battle. They were to fight their way south. Not retreat. Fight. At Yudam-ni, the situation had reached a breaking point. Marine regiments were surrounded on multiple sides, cut off from the main supply route, and under constant pressure from Chinese forces occupying the high ground. The enemy controlled the ridgelines, watching every movement below. Any attempt to move in daylight drew immediate fire. The order was clear. The Marines would move south toward Hagaru-ri. But the distance on a map did not reflect the reality on the ground. The route passed through Toktong Pass, a narrow mountain corridor that controlled the only viable road south. Whoever held the pass controlled survival. The Chinese knew this. They had already moved to block it. Before the main body could advance, Toktong Pass had to be secured. A small marine unit was tasked with holding the position against overwhelming odds. They dug into frozen ground, carving fighting positions with explosives and entrenching tools that shattered in the cold. Night after night, Chinese forces attacked. Wave after wave came through the darkness, climbing the slopes, closing to within yards of marine positions. Ammunition dwindled. Casualties mounted. Sleep became impossible. Yet the Marines held, understanding that if Toktong Pass fell, thousands of their brothers would be trapped with no escape. Their stand would become one of the most critical actions of the entire battle. As the main column prepared to move, wounded men were gathered. Vehicles were repaired with frozen hands. Units were reorganized, mixing survivors from shattered companies into new formations. There was no room for disorder. Movement began under constant threat. The march south was unlike anything taught in training manuals. It was a slow, grinding advance under fire, with rear guards fighting to keep the road open while lead elements cleared ambushes ahead. Chinese forces attacked from the hillsides, the valleys, and the road itself. The enemy seemed endless. Each night brought new assaults. Each morning revealed the cost. Frozen bodies, both American and Chinese, lined the route. Some had died fighting. Others had simply succumbed to the cold. Leadership mattered more than ever. Officers walked the column, checking on men, issuing calm instructions, restoring order when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm discipline. Non-commissioned officers carried wounded, redistributed ammunition, and took command when leaders fell. In one instance, a Marine machine gunner continued firing despite severe frostbite, his hands frozen to the weapon. Others fought on with broken feet, refusing evacuation until the column was safe. At Toktong Pass, the small holding force still clung to its position. When the main body finally reached the pass, they found Marines who had been fighting for days without relief. Their stand had bought time. Their sacrifice had saved the column. The road south remained open. But the worst was yet to come. As the column descended toward Hagaru-ri, Chinese forces intensified their attacks, attempting to cut the road behind them. Rear guard actions became desperate, often fought at close range. Units leapfrogged backward, covering one another with disciplined fire. Despite constant pressure, cohesion never fully collapsed. Men who could no longer walk were loaded onto trucks. When vehicles broke down, they were abandoned only after their wounded were transferred. No one was left behind unless there was absolutely no alternative. By the time the leading elements reached Hagaru-ri, the perimeter was already under attack. Fires burned throughout the position, illuminating the night sky. The airstrip, now operational, became the center of everything. Here, Marines and soldiers briefly regrouped. But rest was short-lived. The Chinese were preparing their next move. Hagaru-ri was never meant to become a fortress. Before the Chinese offensive, it had been little more than a logistical point, a place to stage supplies and coordinate movement around the reservoir. But by the time the Marines from Yudam-ni fought their way south, Hagaru-ri had become the center of survival for thousands of American troops. The perimeter was under constant attack. Chinese forces recognized its importance immediately. If Hagaru-ri fell, the road south would be severed, and the remaining United Nations forces would be trapped beyond recovery. Every night, attacks pressed against the defensive lines. Mortar fire fell without warning. Small units probed for weak points, testing the resolve of exhausted defenders. Inside the perimeter, conditions were brutal. Men slept in short, frozen intervals, often sitting upright with weapons across their laps. The wounded filled every available shelter. Medics worked without rest, performing amputations and emergency procedures in sub-zero temperatures, often without adequate anesthesia. Many lives were saved simply because someone refused to stop working. The airstrip became the heart of the defense. Engineers had carved it out of frozen ground using explosives, working under fire, knowing that failure meant disaster. When aircraft began landing regularly, the psychological impact was immediate. Supplies arrived. Ammunition stocks were replenished. Most importantly, wounded men were evacuated. Each departing aircraft carried not just casualties, but proof that the force had not been abandoned. American air power played a decisive role at Hagaru-ri. Close air support missions flew continuously, striking Chinese troop concentrations on surrounding hills and interdicting movement along mountain paths. Pilots operated in extreme cold and limited visibility, often relying on ground markers and radio calls from units under fire. The coordination between ground forces and air support became a lifeline. Yet even with air superiority, the situation remained precarious. Chinese commanders adjusted their tactics, launching larger assaults and attempting to overwhelm the perimeter through sheer numbers. On several nights, attacks came dangerously close to breaking through. Fighting devolved into close-quarters combat, with grenades and small arms determining survival. Still, the line held. General Smith understood that Hagaru-ri was only a temporary refuge. The ultimate objective was Hungnam, the port city far to the south where evacuation could be conducted if necessary. Between Hagaru-ri and Hungnam lay miles of hostile terrain, narrow roads, and enemy-controlled high ground. The most dangerous obstacle lay ahead. Funchilin Pass. As preparations began to move south once more, word arrived that the bridge at Funchilin Pass had been destroyed. Without it, vehicles could not pass. Artillery, wounded, and supplies would be stranded. Thousands of lives depended on a solution. Engineers assessed the damage and confirmed the worst. The gap was too large to cross by conventional means. The response was as audacious as it was desperate. Sections of a portable bridge were requested by air. Aircraft flew in heavy loads, dropping bridge components by parachute into contested territory. Under enemy observation and fire, engineers assembled the bridge in freezing conditions, hands numb, tools sticking to skin. It was built anyway. When the first vehicles crossed Funchilin Pass, it marked a turning point. The road south was once again open. But opening the road did not mean safety. The final march would test what remained of the force. With the bridge at Funchilin Pass restored, the road south lay open in theory. In reality, it was a gauntlet. The movement from Hagaru-ri toward Kotori and onward to Hungnam would be the final and most punishing phase of the battle. The Chinese were fully aware that this was their last opportunity to destroy the encircled force. Every ridge, every curve of the road, every narrow defile became a potential killing zone. The column moved deliberately. Vehicles were arranged with wounded and essential equipment protected at the center. Infantry units formed a moving shield, advancing along the high ground while others guarded the rear. Artillery and tanks provided fire support when terrain allowed, though the cold continued to take its toll on machinery. Rear guard actions became constant. As the main body advanced, Chinese forces repeatedly attempted to cut the road behind them, launching sudden attacks from the hillsides and disappearing just as quickly. Small unit engagements erupted without warning, often at close range. These were not battles of sweeping maneuvers, but brutal fights for yards of frozen ground. The exhaustion was absolute. Men marched for hours without rest, their breath freezing in the air, faces wrapped in scarves stiff with ice. Hunger gnawed constantly. Many had not eaten a hot meal in days. Yet the discipline of the column never completely broke. That discipline was its greatest weapon. Leadership at every level proved decisive. Platoon leaders improvised defensive positions on the move. Squad leaders rotated men through firing positions to keep weapons operational. Medics continued to work while barely able to feel their own hands. The wounded were a constant concern. Those who could walk did so, leaning on rifles or the shoulders of comrades. Those who could not were carried, sometimes for miles. When vehicles broke down and had to be destroyed, their wounded passengers were transferred first, without exception. No one was left behind. At Hagaru-ri, another perimeter was established under fire. Once again, the enemy attacked at night, testing defenses, probing for weakness. Once again, the line held. Air support struck enemy positions with devastating effect, buying time for the column to reorganize and prepare for the final leg. The road from Hagaru-ri to Hungnam descended gradually, but danger did not diminish. Chinese units continued their relentless pursuit, accepting staggering losses in an attempt to break the American withdrawal. Bodies accumulated along the hillsides, grim evidence of the cost of their tactics. Still, attacks continued. What sustained the American force through this final phase was not optimism, but resolve. They no longer expected relief. They expected only to finish what they had started. As the outskirts of Hungnam finally came into view, the scale of what had been achieved began to register. Against overwhelming odds, under some of the worst conditions imaginable, the encircled force had fought its way out. They had not broken. They had not surrendered. They had endured. Hungnam was never meant to receive an army in retreat. It was a port city, industrial and exposed, pressed against the sea. Yet in December of 1950, it became the final refuge for tens of thousands of United Nations troops, refugees, vehicles, and equipment flowing south under constant threat. As the first elements of X-Corps reached the outskirts of the city, the reality of the situation came fully into focus. The Chinese army was still advancing. Time was limited. Decisions made in the coming days would determine whether the force escaped intact or collapsed at the edge of the sea. Planning began immediately. Naval vessels gathered offshore in increasing numbers. Transports, cargo ships, and warships formed a floating lifeline. The objective was clear: evacuate personnel and equipment while denying the enemy anything of value. The operation would require precision on a massive scale. While evacuation plans were finalized, defensive lines were established around Hungnam. Once again, American troops dug in, covering approaches, securing roads, and preparing to hold long enough for the evacuation to be completed. Chinese units continued to probe the defenses, pressing forward cautiously after the losses they had already suffered. Meanwhile, an unexpected humanitarian crisis unfolded. Thousands of Korean civilians began arriving at Hungnam, fleeing south in fear of what would follow the Chinese advance. Families arrived with nothing but what they could carry. Old men, women, children, all seeking passage away from the coming storm. The decision was made to evacuate them as well. What followed became one of the largest humanitarian evacuations in military history. Alongside soldiers and Marines, civilians were loaded onto ships in vast numbers. There was little order at first, only urgency. Yet discipline prevailed, even under these conditions. As ships departed one by one, they carried not only troops, but the human cost of the war itself. Behind them, engineers prepared the city for destruction. Supplies that could not be evacuated were destroyed. Fuel dumps were burned. Infrastructure was rendered unusable. When the final ships departed, demolition charges were detonated across the port, denying the enemy any immediate use of the facilities. On December 24, 1950, the evacuation of Hungnam was complete. X-Corps was gone. The Chinese army arrived too late. In the weeks that followed, the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir began to be understood, slowly, and with debate. At first glance, the movement south appeared to some as a retreat. Territory had been abandoned. Objectives had changed. The war had not ended by Christmas. But those who had been there knew better. What had taken place at Chosin was not a collapse, but a disciplined fighting withdrawal under extreme pressure. An entire force, surrounded and outnumbered, had fought its way out while preserving its cohesion, its leadership, and its honor. The cost had been severe. More than 17,000 American casualties were recorded, many caused by frostbite and exposure rather than enemy fire. Entire units were permanently scarred by the experience. For those who survived, the memory of the cold never truly faded. Yet the Chinese losses were far greater. Entire divisions had been shattered in repeated assaults against well-organized defenses. The Chinese army learned, at tremendous cost, that American forces would not break easily, even under the harshest conditions imaginable. For the Marines of the 1st Marine Division, Chosin became part of their identity. Veterans would forever refer to themselves as the Frozen Chosin. It was not a badge of suffering alone, but of endurance. General Oliver P. Smith's words endured because they captured the truth of what happened. Retreat had not been an option. Movement south had been conducted as an attack, deliberate, controlled, and relentless. Every mile had been contested. Every decision had been measured against survival. Chosin did not end the Korean War. But it changed it. It demonstrated that discipline, leadership, and unity could overcome even the most desperate circumstances. It proved that morale could survive cold, hunger, and encirclement. And it reminded history that defeat is not defined by direction, but by collapse. At Chosin, there was no collapse. There was resolve. There was brotherhood. And there was honor. When retreat was no longer an option, they chose to fight forward, and history remembers them for it.